Hi, it's Dennis once again, and it's time for Tuesday Talks with Pastor Dennis, where I bring a message for the children of Christ Community Church. Recently, we've been working our way through a series of questions, each aimed at responding to the question that arises within our hearts. How do we respond when our hearts are met with anxious thoughts? In that today's question is number 3 out of a series of 4 questions. It's going to be helpful if we review the first 2 questions as well as this 4-point overarching summary that these questions align themselves with. So let's look at that 4-point overarching summary. First point being relationships, where in the beginning God was setting in right order relationships. Moving toward rebellion, where in the garden Adam and Eve rebel against God's authority and they seek to establish authority within themselves. Moving toward redemption, where God gives the promises that He ultimately will be the one who brings redemption and renews the relationship between man and Himself, ultimately culminating in restoration. So that's the 4-point summary. Now, the first 2 questions were, where were you? And where are you? I know they sound similar. The first one being presented to Job, where were you when I laid the foundations of the world? And in this context, God is reorienting Job in the midst of great suffering, and He's having Job to recognize that God is ultimately the one in authority, rightly so, and that He is the creator of heaven and earth and all that it contains. The second question being in the garden, where Adam and Eve have broken the relationship and God recognizes that, but is not dissuaded by that, and is instead intent on pursuing them and meets them with the question, where are you? And we looked at that last time, and they were hiding, and we recognize that when we find ourselves hiding, whether it's in sin and darkness, that we need to approach God and have God to bring light to bear upon those situations. And that's the first 2 steps of quieting our hearts before God. And I hope you see that these questions are a cumulative effect that they have, and it's helpful to approach quieting our hearts by going through each of these questions, not just taking one out randomly. Which leads us to this third question, which I find to be the central question, if not in this series of 4 questions, certainly central in each individual life. Because this is a question that Jesus raises in the gospel directly to His disciples. And the question is, being asked by Jesus, who do you say that I am? Now, He precedes this question by asking, who do the people say that I am? And His disciples respond by identifying very recognizable and credible individuals. But then Jesus turns to them and says, who do you say that I am? To which Peter responds, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And we have to recognize what all that question and that response holds in seed form. When Jesus is asking the question, who do you say that I am? He's inviting you into a relationship with Him. He's asking, do you recognize that I am the fulfillment of God's promises throughout all the Old Testament, beginning with the first promise given in the garden, starting with Eve and moving to Job, and we've got promises to Moses and Zechariah and Malachi. David speaks extensively on this coming Messiah so that we would know who He is by His works and His words. And it's uniquely found in Jesus, who would take upon Himself the sins of the world and be raised to new life so that in fulfillment of those promises and in alignment with that overarching summary point, redemption is by God's work that He redeems us. So you have to ask yourself, who do you say that Jesus is? Is He the fulfillment of God's promises? And is He God's offering for you to be renewed in right relationship with him. When you work your way through these questions, it is only by recognizing that Jesus is the Christ that you will be able to be still and know that he is God.